On this episode of Public Scrutiny, we'll be reviewing and commenting on BBC Question Time, which aired on the 16th of April 2020. These Question Time vids take me a long time to do. I've been up all night doing it, so if you appreciate it, please help the channel to grow by giving it a like and clicking on that subscribe button. Thank you.
Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Robert Buckland, Secretary of State for Justice, previously Solicitor General for England and Wales, Labour's newly appointed Shadow Foreign Secretary and one of three final candidates in the contest to become party leader, and joining us from home, Lisa Nandy, Karen Billamoria, founder and chairman of Cobra Beer, crossbench life peer and vice president of the CBI, and a doctor who specialises in palliative care, currently working full-time on the front line and author of Dear Life, a book on dying with dignity, Rachel Clark. Good evening and welcome to my guests here in the studio and to Lisa, who's joining us from Wigan. As you know, we have no studio audience here with us, which is a pretty strange feeling, I have to say.
Oh, I'm sure you're getting used to it by now, Fiona.
But this week's pre-recorded questions come from Wolverhampton, which is an area that's seen high levels of coronavirus and, sadly, high levels of deaths too. So we have pre-recorded questions from there. Sadly, of course, we can't be there in person. But if you have anything that you want to say from home, comments or questions that you want to feed into the panel here, contact us on social media at BBC Question Time. I will get those comments on this tablet here and I will feed them in as we go along. So let's take our first question. But actually, before we do, particularly because you are here, Rachel, on your day off, so thank you so much, and you are on the front line. We just all wanted to do our clap for carers because, of course, we were sitting here watching it. So I think let's just show our appreciation. Thank you, Rachel.
So, a couple of things at this point. Did anyone see that video? Not entirely sure what it was called, but there was a hashtag, We Will Remember. Well, if you've not, it's worth watching. I did a commentary on it yesterday. I was staggered by it. And secondly, at 8 PM, I was watching on BBC One what looked to be 30 to 40 NHS workers standing outside of a hospital clapping. Then it cuts to a load of police cars with their lights on parked on the bridge by Parliament. Regarding the NHS workers, I think most people are under the impression that you guys are snowed under and working 24/7. So I was surprised to see so many of you stood outside, happy smiling faces and giving yourselves the clap. And the police. I hope that was a one-off. It's not a good idea to have it widely known that most of you will be parked up on a bridge every Thursday at 8 PM. Just saying. That We Will Remember vid, in my opinion, was a bad move by whoever's idea it was.
So let's take our first pre-recorded question tonight, and that is from Frank Wilson.
Good evening. My question is this. If the mark of a civilized society is the extent to which it provides for its most vulnerable members, how many marks out of 10 would the panel give to this country for its record on social care?
Oh, the thing is, most people, when healthy, don't even stop to consider this. Why would they? They work most of their lives playing the game with the assumption that they'll be looked after when they need the help. If, when they actually need the help, they find out that things are not what they expected, well, by then it's a bit too late, isn't it? And I say that as someone who has observed people getting kicked while they're down.
So how many marks out of 10 would the panel give to this country's record on social care in this coronavirus crisis?
Hold on, his audio carried on for a few seconds after he finished speaking. He didn't mention the coronavirus crisis. You appear to have added that yourself.
Well, I want to ask you first, Rachel, since this is very much your area.
Absolutely, and in answer to this question, I can say that I am seeing right now, precisely on the front line, exactly the esteem in which we hold our most vulnerable members in society. So, of course, people in care homes are predominantly our elderly citizens. They're also sometimes young people, disabled people as well. And we know that these individuals historically, not just for the last 10 years, I'd say for at least the last couple of decades across both political parties, have been some of the most marginalised, neglected, abandoned and diminished members of our society. Successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, I have to say, although of course in the last 10 years under the guise of austerity these have been Conservative governments, have prevaricated, talked the talk about addressing the grotesque underfunding of our social care sector while failing actually to deliver.
Wow, I like this lady already. I'd say that that was a non-political answer. At least it apportions blame to both sides. Now, I don't know too much about palliative care except that it's about quality of life and often is something that terminally ill people receive. I imagine that people in that field have a perspective that not many others have.
There have been 17 white papers, green papers and national state reviews into the funding of our social care sector in that time, in the last 20 years, and precisely no action. So now we have a sector that we know is caring for society's most vulnerable members, and yet it has been run down and underfunded into an absolute travesty of what it should be. You have that as the background into which inserts itself a virus that we know from China and Italy particularly affects these vulnerable elderly members of society more than anyone else. The death rate soars once you get into people in their 70s and 80s.
And how do you feel the government has responded to that when it comes to care homes?
Absolutely woefully inadequately, I'm afraid. So the point at which the government decided to change its testing policy so that every possible case was being tested to one in which only cases in hospitals were being tested was the point at which members, residents of care homes and people receiving care in their own homes were thrown under a bus. They were being abandoned.
What I realised was that government of whatever colour has a tendency to remove help when you need it most, knowing that you can't fight back, either because you're too ill and or because you don't have much time left. They would kick your appeal into the long grass knowing that the chances are you won't even make it to the appeal hearing. And as I say, by the time you find out how things really are, often it's too late.
And incidentally so were the absolutely extraordinary men and women who are carers themselves. We are meant to have parity in this country. We are meant to have a department that is the Department of Health and Social Care, and yet the social side of that department is the Cinderella service. We have 122,000 vacancies in the care sector. Many of carers are paid the minimum wage. They're treated without respect. Yesterday, of course, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, tried to address that by offering them a badge.
Does that not seem a little bit contemptuous? We need equipment. Well, here's a badge.
Actually, we've had a comment in about the badge. Let me just find it. Please explain, Maureen Cleater, please explain why a badge is supposed to make a real difference to you and my colleagues in the fight against COVID-19 when what we need is PPE and testing. I mean, Robert, you've heard the Association of Adult Directors of Social Care saying it's shambolic, it's been haphazard, it's paltry. There's been a huge amount of criticism of the way the government has handled the social care sector when it comes to coronavirus. What marks would you give the government out of 10 for that?
Well, look, what marks out of 10 are very difficult to assess at the moment because we're in the middle of this crisis.
It's a shame that Fiona added that extra bit onto the question because now he has the perfect get-out of answering it. The question was more generalised than being just about the crisis.
Well, no,
I'm not going to pretend that everything in the garden's lovely. I don't do that because a lot of us have relatives and friends, people we know in care homes who are getting, frankly, outstanding treatment from carers who work, so hard and incredibly hard.
Did you hear that? I'm paraphrasing here, but he pretty much just said, I'm not going to pretend that everything's lovely in the garden. I don't do that because a lot of us have relatives and friends and people we know in care homes who are getting frankly outstanding treatment from carers. If he'd have said, I'm not going to pretend that everything is lovely in the garden because we know that there are problems and some people don't get all the care they need, that would make sense. As it is, he doesn't pretend that everything is lovely in the garden because everything in the garden is apparently lovely.
I think the badge is just part of a sincere and genuine move, not just by the government, but by the care sector itself, to seek to improve the recognition for care workers.
But if you don't want to give answer Frank's question with marks out of 10, how would you rate, categorise, describe the government's performance in the coronavirus crisis when it comes to social care so far?
I'd say more to do, a lot more to do.
So no acceptance of fault there then. How would you rate your performance so far? How have you done, past tense? There's a lot more to do, future tense.
Which is why yesterday's announcement by Matt Hancock was very important in terms of the way in which testing will be applied, the recruitment drive that we are embarking upon with regard to extra care workers.
Would that involve flying them in from other countries like you do fruit and veg pickers?
The genuine push by government to deal with what is clearly a very vulnerable sector, and I think Claire's absolutely right to talk about the particular challenges in care homes. We want to see that infection rate reduced within our care homes, because if we don't reduce it there, and indeed in other vulnerable parts of our society, we're not going to get the overall rate down, and that's so important in dealing with this crisis.
Thanks, Claire, for answering the question as asked by the guy in the video. She's already this week's star for me. I'll make sure she has a nice thumbnail, I promise.
Lisa, the question is, how many marks out of 10 should the government receive for its treatment of social care in this current crisis?
Let's face it, we can probably guess where she'll go with this one. Point scoring, pandering to the NHS and care workers, and a bit of virtue signalling. Prove me wrong, Lisa.
Well, I don't really want to get into scoring the government out of 10. If you remember the Labour leadership contest, we were all constantly being asked to score each other out of 10, and actually doesn't really get us anywhere as a country. The thing that I want to see the government do now is recognise, as I think Matt Hancock has, that they've been too slow to understand the crisis emerging in our care homes, and then just take action to deal with it. There was a commitment very early on that the NHS would get all of the resources that it needs to deal with this crisis. The same commitment should surely be made to social care as well. I think it's really important that the government starts producing daily statistics about deaths in care homes, because we need to track this, understand where the problem is, and what more we need to be doing to tackle it. We need to roll out testing to the social care sector. I really welcome the fact that the government has said that they will now do this and has started to do this, but we've got 1.2 million people who work in our social care sector, and as of yesterday only around 500 tests had actually been carried out. And the biggest issue that I get from home carers, care home workers here in Wigan is still this question about PPE, personal protective equipment. Last night, one of those care home workers messaged me to say that she'd been on Amazon buying protective gear because although they finally got sent some masks, those masks are already running out. And she said to me, it's really, really hard to overstate how scared people are. We're trying our best not to get this virus, but we know it's a question of when, not if. They're working in small rooms where they can't socially distance. It takes 2 people to move a resident, so they can't keep away from each other either. I have one constituent who's got a young baby, a wife and young baby at home. He's not just terrified about getting it himself or giving it to the people, the very vulnerable people that he's looking after. He's terrified about what's going to happen to his family as well. And the worst thing about the message that I got last night was a very, very common theme, which is, you know, she said to me, don't obviously reveal who I am because I would lose my job. Now, we have shamefully underpaid, undertreated, undervalued people who work in this absolutely vital sector for a very, very long time. And we need to get them the support that they need right now in order to do their jobs, their important jobs, safely. But when this is over, we need a proper reckoning as a country about how we came to get this so badly wrong.
Well, I don't mind admitting that I was not as spot on as I thought I'd be. Sure, there were elements that were in line with my prediction, but truth be told, it was nowhere near as bad as I was expecting. Fair play to you.
Karen Bill-Moria?
I think we're in awe of the NHS and what they've done, and we respect it so much. But there's no question about it. Who's mentioned the care sector in the last month? And now suddenly it's come to light. And as Lisa said, approaching 1.5 million people work in this sector, doing such an amazing job in the most difficult circumstances, getting paid very little, looking after 1 million people, half of them in care homes, the other half at home. I mean, this is extraordinary work. And then what I find really difficult to understand is we've been measuring these sad deaths, and every death is awful, and Thoughts go out to all the families.
Oh God, here we go. I do tend to look out for the emotion behind people's voices. He says his thoughts go out to all the families like he's dictating a letter to his secretary. That amount of virtue coming from the owner of a large corporation in the world we live in, sorry, not buying it. Please do go on though.
All the loved ones, we have not but counting the care homes. I don't understand. I mean, in testing, we know from other countries that 50% of the deaths, sadly, often take place in care homes. And here we have not been testing the staff, we've not been testing the patients. They've been going to hospital, and I'm hearing stories of going to hospital and not being tested when they're in hospital and being sent back to the care homes. So at long last, it's getting the attention it deserves and the focus that it deserves. And looking forward, we're going to be learning lots of lessons from this, and we'll be far better off as a country looking forward. And I think the care sector is going to be far more highlighted, appreciated, funded, and resourced.
I've got my eye on you, but actually I do agree with him. I've said a few times before this pandemic that people in this country need to realise that one day they may very well end up being the ones who need the care when they get old. Nurses get long-term training. Why not have social care training along those same lines, where you end up with a diploma at the end, a legit qualification? Make it a career rather than just a job, and for God's sake give them a decent wage. The idea that someone who has to clean poo off the infirm without being judgmental or making them feel humiliated ends up with the same wage as someone who makes coffee seems more than a little unjust to me. But then perhaps the wage they get is an indicator of how much they're actually valued.
We've had some more comments in. So Gareth Thomas says, I think to isolate and catch the spread of the virus, you should test everyone in care homes. When you know the residents that have it versus those that don't, same for the carers, only then can you isolate and deal with coronavirus. I mean, if we knew from the start, says Rona, this would kill older and vulnerable people more, why weren't nursing and care homes the first priority? What else can we conclude except they didn't care?
I can see why you might reach that conclusion on account of it staring us right in the face, but it's not as simple as that. Prioritisation of resources and so forth. Plus, I think it goes back to government taking the herd immunity approach. I reckon they knew perfectly well that the elderly would be most affected. That being the case, why would they bother testing? They wanted most of us to get the virus, so why would they divert resources to those who they believed were most at risk of dying? I know that sounds callous, but we've long since moved away from the time where you would get treatment if they believed that they could save your life. Limited resources. Let's say two people need a life-saving operation. One is 25 and the other is 65, and you only have the resources to operate on one of them. All of a sudden you're in the realm of economic viability. Resources are diverted to those who it's most likely will be able to contribute back into the system. I found that one out when my stepfather had cancer. Times changed, only they never told you that things had changed. They let you carry on thinking that things were the same as they always had been. You only find out that they aren't when it's too late, which is full circle on the statement I made near the start of this vid.
I mean, it does seem odd, Robert, that the advice given by Public Health England back in February, at the start of all this, was it remains very unlikely that people receiving care in a care home or the community will become infected. There was no mention of PPE, and people were told not to wear masks in care homes because they serve no purpose. Looking back on that now, with the great benefit of hindsight, of course, that seems extraordinary.
Not really. They chose the herd immunity path. But how would it have looked if government did nothing and loads of people died? So they had to make it look like they didn't want us to get it, which is why the advice they gave us seemed counterintuitive at the time and later turned out to be bollocks.
Well, but of course it was advice that was tendered and was listened to, and the priority was given quite naturally to the front line in the NHS.
But do you think that was the right advice?
Well, I think care homes are complex places. If they can be managed in a way, for example, if there's a particular problem on a particular wing and they can isolate that group of people carefully, then it can be managed in a sensible way. But there is no doubt that because of the age and the vulnerability and the fact that, you know, elderly people have
that's not really the point. It's whether the advice was right back in February.
Look, I mean, I would say that where you've got a lot of people with underlying conditions who are elderly, they're going to be vulnerable to this disease.
What a load of codswallop. All he did there was explain why the elderly are especially vulnerable to the virus when the question was about the advice that was given.
I mean, Robert, I think that's slightly disingenuous because actually we had a lot of information from other countries who were ahead of us in terms of the impact on people in care homes from this virus. So we knew exactly what we were going to be up against. For example, in Italy and in Spain, ahead of us on the curve, we heard the most appalling reports of paramedics going into residents' homes and care homes and finding those elderly men and women literally lying dead in their beds. They had just died of coronavirus with nobody there. They died alone, the worst possible kind of death. And we knew that weeks and weeks ago.
Of course they knew. Herd immunity means they wanted us to catch the virus, which means that people would die from it and that the elderly were most at risk. They absolutely knew that. Government deliberately acted in a manner that they knew would lead to the deaths of those that they are charged with taking care of. There's no getting away from that.
The other thing I think it's important to stress is what we're hearing about PPE, it's easy to talk about that in abstract terms, but for the people who are actually caring for these patients, whether they're NHS or social carers, it is really hard to overemphasise how frightening it is to go to work, put on PPE that you know in many cases is lower in standards than the WHO standards. You do the best you can. You cannot do anything but help your vulnerable patients or people you're caring for, but you know it's inadequate. And that's even in hospitals sometimes where we're getting the best supply of PPE. In care homes, I know, because people are telling me, I work with carers, that they are having to do things like literally wear a sanitary towel over their face because that's the best they can come up with to protect themselves from infection. They aren't getting the masks, they're having to reuse the masks, they're not getting the gowns, they're not getting everything they need. They should all have protection on their eyes, they're not getting it. They still help these vulnerable patients, and they do that putting their own lives at risk and the lives of their children, their families at risk. And it's just not acceptable to say, we're doing more, we're going to fix this.
She's rock solid so far. You can answer questions all day long by saying we need to do more, but the question is, what have you done? Not a lot, it would seem.
Where is the PPE now? We're a rich country with the 5th richest economy in the world. Surely it is within the remit of this country and this government to produce sufficient paper masks and plastic gowns to protect carers, and if not, why not?
We've got a comment in here from Bonji who says, I run a care home and my staff place their lives on the line every day, yet I can only pay them the minimum wage. This area has been ignored by successive governments. We can't even order PPE for their safety. Despite this, he says, they remain diligent and professional. I think we could talk about this for some time. I'm going to move on and take another question, if I may, from Duncan Moore.
So given the potential plight of many SMEs who are very likely going to go out of business during this endless lockdown, what is the panel's view exactly of how the government is going to manage and balance the transition out of lockdown anytime soon without compromising the health of the nation?
What, like they haven't compromised it already?
So, Karen, I wanted to ask you about this first. I mean, obviously, you as head and founder of Cobra Beer, how is this affecting your business? I can only assume badly. And what's your view in terms of how we begin to come out of this? Duncan is talking about SMEs in particular. Small and medium-sized enterprises, I should say.
There's no question about it. This is the worst possible crisis. It's a living nightmare for the business sector, not just in the UK, but around the world. It's a demand shock, it's a supply shock, it's a domino effect, it's everybody in the supply chain. In our case, we supply thousands of restaurants, and basically they're all shut. They're not allowed to operate. Some of them do takeaways, but that's only a small amount. They have no revenue. So that directly affects us, and the vast majority of our sales are foundation of the restaurants. We can supply supermarkets, but again, over there, with the production, we can't produce because a lot of our staff are not, for safety reasons, not working. So our production's reduced. So even our supermarket sales are not as high as they could be. So we're affected very badly. But we hold webinars with the restaurants every week, and they are crying. They've run out of cash already. And
So are the loans that have been a huge amount of money that has been provided by the government, is that not working?
Full credit to the government. They did a great job right at the beginning. £330 billion, £60 billion of employee support, rates being free for a year for retail outlets, being allowed to delay your taxes, delay your VAT, landlords not being able to throw you out for 3 months, all sorts of help, which has been fantastic, grants as well. But the one help that businesses need is cash now, and that's the CBILS loan, the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, particularly the one for under £45 million turnover companies, and that's not working as well as it should.
This is another thing that rings alarm bells for me. Knowing the globalists' plan, it seems that the large corporations were to be the only ones that would survive, which is pretty much what they wanted, and it looks like they're going to get it. There isn't much time left to stop them from taking everything over, but oh look, we're on lockdown, so we can't even protest against it.
And why is it not working?
Well, 300,000 businesses have applied to these loans. There are over 40 banks that are authorised to give them, and at the moment the government guarantees 80% of these loans. Out of those 300,000, just 6,000 have actually been given the loans over 3.5 weeks later.
So what's the problem then?
And only £1 billion out of the £330 billion. And I think the main reason, and I've been saying this right from the beginning, we've got to be like Germany's doing, like Switzerland is doing, where there the government guarantees 100% of the loans up to £500,000, equivalent roughly. In Switzerland, they guarantee to give you that money within 48 hours. I know businesses there that have got the loan, applied it within 12 hours. So we need to guarantee loans for a limit, for example, £500,000, because it's mainly the SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises, that need this help.
And the issue
is that if we give that 100% guarantee, then the banks will be able to lend that money
because they won't be worrying about being liable for the 20%.
For that 20%. And for the sake of the 20%, the government is going the extra mile. There's £200 billion of quantitative easing. Interest rates at 0.1%, the lowest since 1694 when the Bank of England was founded. I mean, you've got to give credit to the government for what it's doing. Do this little extra bit, and the money will flow through. And then the businesses will get the cash they need now. And they need the cash. What's the point of all these other measures? The employee support scheme, which is fantastic, giving £2,500 a month up to 80% of salaries, is great. But if the company isn't surviving when we come out of the lockdown, they need the cash to survive. And I think that 100% will do it.
Those who own the banks and the huge multinationals are the same ones who want to take everything over, so it's not really in their interests to help everyone through this. They want the crash. They've been planning it for decades. The new world. Can you guess what the next word is?
Lisa?
Well, I think the government was right to extend the lockdown today. I think we have to be guided by the evidence about infection rates and whether this is getting under control, and the criteria that they set out around making sure that the NHS could cope in particular is very, very important. But there are definitely things that could be done now to help to deal with the economic fallout from all of this. And I very, very much agree that the CBILS scheme, the loan scheme for small businesses, needs to be reformed. The problem that a lot of small businesses have in getting access to that, and the number who've actually managed to access help under it is vanishingly small, is that the banks seem to be fairly reluctant to lend because the government hasn't underwritten 100% of those loans, as you rightly just heard has been done in Germany and Switzerland.
Almost makes you wonder why the banks were given the money in the first place. Here's a few $100 billion, help out the little guy, and then they just keep hold of the money.
And that means that businesses just aren't getting the help they need. I have businesses here in Wigan that are perfectly profitable, healthy, viable businesses, but are taking a short-term hit now, for example, because their travel business was one that was in touch with me last week, where people clearly aren't booking holidays at the moment. But once this is over, they'll start to see recovery. But they need the cash now, and they just simply can't get it. But I think alongside that as well, we need to think about what is our exit strategy from lockdown and start to set out some clarity from the government about how they anticipate this looking, because many of those small businesses are having to make decisions about how long they can remain viable in this situation. They may need additional support if this is going to go on for a long time. And in other countries, the lifting of restrictions has happened in very, very different ways. So, for example, in some countries, small businesses have been allowed to reopen, small shops have been allowed to reopen. I was speaking to the Prime Minister in Sweden today who has they've pursued a strategy of keeping some businesses open and still running. And if businesses knew what the government was intending, they would be able to start planning for this now. At the moment, they just don't have the clarity that they need about what the government is proposing. And that means that when we do come out of this immediate public health crisis, we may find that a lot of people don't have those jobs to go back to.
Which means that the number of people dependent on the state will go through the roof, and at that point they have us by the balls. Who's going to bite the hand that feeds them?
So two things there, Robert. Well, Douglas also asked about how do we begin to get out of the lockdown. Let's come to that in a moment. But Karen's talking about the coronavirus business interruption loans, as was Lisa, going to 100% as opposed to 80%, but also giving business some certainty where you can about when they might start to begin to think about, because they need to plan about when they might start coming out of this.
They do. I mean, we can't get away from the inherent uncertainty that this unprecedented challenge faces. I mean, there are two themes there. I mean, first of all, Karen's point about the banks and their role in this. We've already taken action to, if you like, declog the process to make it easier for that money to reach the firms and people that it's intended to reach. And the Treasury is constantly looking at the scheme and its operation to see how better.
But what about this business of increasing the coronavirus business interruption loan to 100% as opposed to 80%?
It's a very fair point. I know that the Treasury are considering the operation of the scheme daily. They set this up at a breakneck speed, and I think rightly tribute's been paid to the fact the government really stood up to the challenge and got on with it. So I think the answer is we're looking daily at the operation of this, because our intention is, as the Chancellor said, is that we'll do what it takes, and we mean what we say by that.
So,
neutral term. What specifically does that mean?
when we get comments in, for example, someone's just calling themselves footy fan. I run a business employing 17 people. I haven't had a penny. I haven't had any grants, loans. I can't get furlough money for myself. I'm taking no salary. If I'm still in business in 2 weeks, it will be a miracle. Vince Travers says, can the government do more to ensure that small businesses can get access to the support they've announced? Banks are taking too long, to come to Karen's point, and declining applications for coronavirus business interruption loans, despite having a viable business. We help the bank with billions. They must do more. But, I mean, you must have heard this time and time again in government. And what can you practically do?
They're right, and the banks have to help us help everybody else. They've got to step up to the mark too. This is a very uncertain and risk-based time. Okay. We expect everybody to take their share of the risk. The government is, laying billions of pounds on the line here to save many, many businesses that we think are worth saving because they do have a future. This is why the Treasury is looking every day at how to improve and refine the system to make sure that it does reach the people who need that money.
And Robert, to the government's credit, you've listened right from the time when Rishi, who's done a great job, when he announced 16th, 17th of March, these are the measures, we said, well, you've left out the self-employed. You listened, and the same employee support equivalents were given to self-employed. Then we said, you've left out the charities. You listened, there's now support for charities. Maybe not as much as is required, but at least there's just approaching £1 billion. Similarly, the startups, the small businesses, the entrepreneurship business, there's no support for them. But there's talk of a fund that's private and government-supported, multi-billion fund, but that needs to be set up quickly. Now, here's something else. The squeezed middle were left out. You've increased the coronavirus business interruption scheme to 500 million, and hopefully more.
We have.
But
and the furlough scheme
But if you do this one thing, I can assure you, increase it to 100%, it'll be worth it, and the money will flow through.
I'm beginning to think that the money is there to prop up the banks, who'd go belly up in short order if people weren't able to pay their existing loans, which would mean it's in the bank's interest to keep hold of as much of that money as they can.
Rach.
I think it's important just to come back to the original question to stress that, unfortunately, however much we're all desperate for an exit strategy, we want to hear it spelt out now. Of course, that's not really the right way to think about this. There isn't an exit strategy. It might be better to think about a management strategy for coronavirus. It isn't going to be quick. There's no quick fix for this. We're not going to suddenly have a period where we say, right, we're relaxing the measures and we can go back to life as normal, however much we want to. This is going to be a period of extended social distancing and restrictions until a vaccine is in place, and that's probably sometime next year.
Of course, this brings a certain software mogul into the equation, and something I wonder is, given Prince Andrew's interview regarding his friendship with Jeffrey, why is it that so many people give so much credence to the software guy when the software guy was just as friendly with Jeffrey? He doesn't even have the luxury of saying that he didn't know what Jeffrey was doing. Andrew gets booted out of his charities and steps back from royal duty and is now tainted, but Bill is all over the media pushing his vaccines, despite his foundation being booted out of India for the damage that his vaccines did to people. He should be just as tainted as Andrew.
So the important thing to think about here is, what are the measures we can take to reduce the overall length of time that we are restricted, with all the economic fallout that that entails? And crucially, that comes back to what we started with, testing. We have to test, we have to contact trace. If we are relaxing restrictions socially, we have to find another way of containing the virus, reducing transmission. And as Professor Neil Ferguson, who's one of the scientists upon whom the government is relying most strongly on for modelling for this, has said only this morning, testing is the way to restrict transmission. So you relax everything in the way that we're desperate to, but you have to test as well, and you have to ramp it up.
Lisa, you just wanted to come back in there.
Yeah, I agree with Rachel, but I think she's actually just given more clarity about an exit strategy than we've had from the government. I mean, yesterday we had a health minister out on social media saying there wouldn't be a lifting or an easing of these restrictions until a vaccine was in place.
I'm sorry, what? That's over a year away, I thought. Lockdown for over a year?
It's effectively suggesting on Twitter that this is going to be in place for 18 months.
You're talking about Nadine Dorris.
Yeah, so if that is the case, then businesses and actually people as well need a level of understanding about that, need the confidence in what the government is doing and to understand why the government is doing it, because I think most people want to do the right thing, but this is really, really hard for a lot of people. You know, for me, who lives with my family, who has an outside space, we've got a garden, this is a very, very different prospect from somebody who is really, really worried that they're going to lose their job, who lives in an overcrowded flat with no outside space, or who has caring responsibilities, or who lives alone. And so the government does need to set out a bit more clarity about how they see this developing, because I appreciate they don't want to give out mixed messages, but at the moment, that is what's happening. And in a public health crisis, the public need confidence that the measures that are being put in place will work. They need to understand them, and then they'll follow them.
Robert, do you want to come back in briefly before I move on to the next question?
I'll just take respectful issue there with Lisa about mixed messages. We've been very clear and simple about the messages.
What, like, we'll do whatever it takes? That's clear and simple, all right, but it says nothing.
The public
She's saying she understands that you don't want to create mixed messages.
And we don't want to create mixed messages, and we're not. The 5 tests that were set out today, which include, and I think Rachel's absolutely right to talk about testing, actually give a very clear map as to how we work our way out of this. And the advice that's going to be given by the strategic, the SAGE group, the strategic advisory group the group that meets to deal with emergencies. Will guide the government. And we will be looking at that advice as it develops over the next few weeks. And I think that is the approach the public would expect us to take, listening to that expert advice and then having a programme of planned return to normality over a period. That's clear. That is something I think the public respect and they understand. And there's a simplicity in that which has cut through to millions of people.
Well, that's one view on it. There is another view. The advice they gave you and that you subsequently gave us turned out to be wrong. Wash your hands. But large gatherings of people, not a problem, even though it sounds counterintuitive. Herd immunity. And from last week, we only know what will be effective once we try it. Yeah, well worthy of respect.
All right. You mentioned testing, and you mentioned testing. Actually, we've got a question on that. So let's take this question now from Keith Bradbury.
Did the government fail to act for 2 months because they knew we could not respond in the same way as Germany, who managed to test, monitor and hospitalise sooner and more efficiently, therefore maintaining a much lower death rate?
Now, Karen, you've got a rather interesting story about testing, haven't you? Because you've had coronavirus and thankfully, it was not a pleasant experience, you told me, but you've come out the other side. Now, the government has talked about trying to get the holy grail of an antibody test, so the test that will tell you if you've had it, and therefore you may have some degree of immunity. And so far, the government's not been able to get one that works. But you have managed to get one that works.
Well, the two, I've maintained personally that one of the key solutions to getting out of this crisis overall is testing. And it's the World Health Organization, the head of it, said over a month ago to the whole world, test, test, test.
The World Health Organization, the one that's coming under fire for its poor response to the pandemic and who Trump just suspended the funding for, that World Health Organization. Please, I'm begging you, whatever you do, don't praise China. Your credibility will drop through the floor.
Now, Germany is testing over 500,000 per week. They were testing over 100,000 per day a long time ago, and I'm glad the government has got a target to get to 100,000 per day in 2 weeks' time, and I hope they do. I believe there are lots of companies willing. What I've learned in this whole crisis, what works, is when the government, the private sector, NHS, armed forces, the Gurkhas, they put up that Nightingale Hospital in 9 days.
OK,
I mean,
but how did you get hold of your antibody test?
I'll come to that. What I'm saying is what works is the collaborative working of business and government and universities, everyone working together, the NHS. With testing, I get the impression that has not happened. It is now happening. So we've got our top pharmaceutical companies, we've got the laboratories, we've got the private sector, NHS, all working together. And I'm sure with that approach, it'll be ramped up. In my case, when I had the disease, the infection, I couldn't get tested. It was only allowed in hospitals, and at that time, not even the NHS staff were allowed to get tested. And so I couldn't get tested, and my doctor said the only way, if you really want to find out, is I can send it to a laboratory in Germany and have to get an intravenous blood test, and then you'll get to know for sure. And then I got the result, and thankfully, it shows I have the antibodies. But I had to say, now we can do that over here.
Just to be clear, so that was the test to show that you had it?
That's the antibody test. Now, the antibody test, government's got the right approach in wanting to have those widely available, and there are home kits that are being mass-produced, including in China.
Oh, you're playing with fire, mate. Carry on, though.
But hang on, I just want to be clear, because there's two tests. There's the test to say that you've got it at the moment, but the test you're talking about is one to say that you had it.
Yes, which is the antibody test.
So how can Karen get that? Presumably because you've got the contact and no one else can.
The government is absolutely right, saying there's no point having antibody tests that are widely available if you can't rely on them, because the mass-produced ones where you take a pinprick and you do an instant, it gives you the results literally within minutes,
but you've
are
got
not
one
working. They're giving false positives.
But you've got one that does work.
That means sending it to a laboratory.
In Germany.
But I'm sure you could send it to a laboratory here in the UK.
So why are they able to do it to do these antibody tests in Germany? We were told a few weeks ago we're going to get these antibody tests. At one point, Sharon White was talking about getting them next week. Then the government rode back. They clearly exist. They exist in Germany. Why can't we have them?
Well, I think one of the issues we found is that, as Karen has said, we've looked at some of these tests that were available and they just didn't pass muster.
But this one did.
And, well, this one did. I mean, Germany has a particular advantage in that their diagnostics industry is much bigger than ours, and we're starting from a much lower base.
But
and
we don't have this test at all.
No, because I think we're starting from a much further back in the field than they are, to be frank.
I don't accept that at all. Why does it matter where you started from? Surely if the tests exist and the mechanisms are there to give good results, you could, from your starting position, have gone down that route at any point. Your starting position bears little relation to the direction you subsequently travel in.
And their death rate is lower because, of course, their rate of testing has been much, much higher. And
so
therefore
if we tested more, would our death rate be lower? Is that what you're saying?
If we were testing much more widely, then we might have a different set of statistics.
A different set of statistics? You mean fewer people would have died? People you now refer to as statistics? Wording aside, though, it does beg the question why more people were not tested earlier on. But then we know the answer already. Herd immunity.
I think it's very difficult sometimes to make those comparisons. What we are doing, though, is, of course, working to ramp it up. And as Karen has said, we've got that partnership between the public and private sector now. We're up to 28,000 capacity today.
What you're saying is important. What you seem to be saying is that, therefore, if we had tested more widely earlier, we would have fewer deaths now?
Well, no, look, I don't...
I think that is what you were saying, isn't it?
What I'm saying, I'm explaining why the German death rate is as it is.
Yeah, we know. They tested people a lot earlier, which enabled them to isolate people, which meant that fewer people died. We've already done that bit. The follow-on question from that is, if we'd have tested people sooner, then our death rate would also be lower than it is now. And your answer to that secondary question is to tell us why Germany's death rate is lower than ours, which we already know. We've done that bit already. This guy has a way of ignoring questions by repeating points that he's already made and which don't really relate to the question he was asked.
I think it's a very invidious task for anybody at the moment, in the middle of this, to start making direct international comparisons, because we all came at this at different times, we've all taken slightly different approaches, and therefore sometimes you're comparing apples with pears. There's no doubt we can learn a lot from other countries, and we're watching very carefully what actions and steps are being taken across Europe, no doubt about that. But ultimately, the particular solution, the particular approach, will have to be tailored very much to domestic need and what we're facing here in the UK.
I actually think the opposite in some respects. I think the international comparison between what has happened here in the UK and Germany is actually very revealing indeed. We know that the first cases appeared in Germany and the UK at almost exactly the same time. However, Germany introduced its most stringent lockdown measures a full week, just over a week before the UK. So that week is absolutely critical.
Whereas our own government told us that large-scale events were not as big a spreader as people might think. It seemed entirely right to us that events should be postponed, but government had different ideas. There are two realities, and like oil and water, they are mutually exclusive. Your job is to keep us safe, and you're trying to convince us that that's what you're doing, when the reality is that you acted so that as many people would catch the virus as possible. That is impossible for you to reconcile, and you're not going to be able to explain it away. But I hope that one day you're properly held to account for that decision. Your actions led to the deaths of a lot of people.
And it will take a long time to know precisely how important that was in terms of overall numbers of deaths and transmission that could have been avoided at a time when we were still allowing, for instance, the Cheltenham Horse Racing Festival to go ahead, where 250,000 people crammed themselves into stands. So that's one important comparison. The other is, yes, Germany has a much better developed pharmaceutical industry. I think everybody agrees on that. But also, actually, the amount of money that Germany spends per capita on health is significantly different than the UK. So here in the NHS, we spend £3,000 per capita in the UK on health. In Germany, that figure is 50% higher. It is £4,500 per capita. So go figure, you already have a starting point that is 50% more capacity in how you're going to manage this crisis. So there's a lesson there in terms of, I'd suggest, how well we fund our health service.
Well, after the PFI deals, it would seem that we're throwing money at private enterprises who can charge the government whatever they like. So it's not really a case of simply putting more money in if it just goes straight into the coffers of a private company.
Because we would be better able to manage the pandemic if we had a stronger starting point. On the point of testing, there's another crucial difference between Germany and the UK, and that is, to begin with, our strategy was broadly the same. It was to test every case and rigorously contact trace. So the moment you identified a case, you then traced everybody else, you shut them down, you self-isolated them to try and stop transmission. There was a point, of course, in the UK at which the government changed strategy, now on the basis of the advice they were given, to abandon testing and contact tracing in the community with many epidemiologists would argue pretty catastrophic fallout.
Well, Public Health England, Public Health England said on March 26th, I think it was Jennifer Harris, correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, there comes a point in a pandemic when testing every case is not an appropriate intervention.
Yeah, that would be when everyone has the virus. What's the point in testing then?
Yes, and I think you're right. It was Jenny Harris who said that, but of course that's...
Was that right in your view?
I would probably defer to the World Health Organization on this. I'm not an epidemiologist, but the WHO have been clear on multiple occasions the way you address any infectious outbreak is test, test, test. That's one of the most important measures you can possibly take. That's what worked in Ebola, for instance, and that's what we have seen work in China, in South Korea, in many other countries.
And yet, as we have heard, even though the means existed for people to be tested, our government did not go down that route.
On the point about antibody testing, Karen, I would just exercise a note of caution. It may be that your test was a very good test, but I think Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, and Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Officer, are absolutely right when they stress caution about diving in and starting to mass produce a test where we actually have not rigorously scientifically validated it.
Absolutely right on that. The one I'm talking about, that is the one that's required in large volumes, is the antigen test, to test the swab test to see if you've got it. One company, I'm told, is ready to supply 1 million per week that have been accredited around the world. Why aren't these tests being made available so that the more people we can test, if they test that they don't have the virus, they can go into work when the lockdown is over?
Well, let me bring
have that testing capability.
Let me bring Lisa into you. Lisa, you've been listening very patiently there. Let me just take you back to the question, because I found it so extraordinary. We had someone in the studio who's had an antibody test, knowing that the Prime Minister and others have been saying this is the holy grail. I couldn't believe someone had actually come along who's had one from Germany, and the question is about Germany. But the question is very specifically, Lisa, did the government fail to act for 2 months because they knew we couldn't respond in the same way as Germany? We just didn't have the wherewithal to do it. That's the question. What's your response to that?
Well, I think the honest answer is that at the moment we don't know. And while we're going to have to unpick what has happened and what has gone wrong when this is over, we've got an immediate crisis that we're trying to deal with. And I think it's widely acknowledged now that we were too slow to recognise the scale of the problem and to implement lockdown. And there was real confusion at the outset, if you remember, about what the government's strategy actually was. There were suggestions in the media that they were pursuing a strategy of herd immunity, where people would get it and then the population would become immune.
Damn it. Not a fan of Labour, as some of you might know, but Lisa Nandy is bang on the money with her answer. The only part I disagree with is when she puts it down to confusion.
But Labour was very supportive of the strategy, certainly at the very beginning.
Well, we were pushing quite hard for lockdown before it happened, because I think it was becoming apparent from other countries as well as from the UK that was important and that people were being put at risk. And if you remember, it took Jeremy Hunt to come out and really push the government on contact tracing and testing before we started to get some action. I mean, the thing that's important now is that I think, broadly speaking, the government has accepted how important this is and is doing, I believe sincerely, everything that they can to try and get us access to those tests. But Matt Hancock set a target of 100,000 tests, which is going to have to be hit in a couple of weeks. And it doesn't look, from the figures that came out this week, that we're anywhere near the amount of making the amount of progress on those things as we should be. So I think it's really important that we actually have a much bigger and renewed focus on that. But I would also just take you back to this point about how about having a better understanding and a more honest assessment and appraisal from government about their strategy to move the country on from this at a moment when it's safe and appropriate to do so. Because there is a concern around the antibody tests that has been raised by a number of behavioural scientists, that with so many people under so much financial pressure to return to work, that what you could end up with is a situation where people felt pressured to actually go out and get the virus in order that they could go and get on with their lives. Now, I don't think that most people would do that, but I think we have to be really, really careful about how we communicate with the public about how we're going to get out of this crisis. Otherwise, you could have unintended consequences. And that's why I think the government needs to be much, much clearer about where they anticipate we're going with this. They won't always get it right. I accept that. And I accept that this is a moving thing that moves very fast, and that we're going to have to respond to the science and adjust the strategy accordingly. But we've got to be more open with the public about what we're doing and why.
Well, Lisa makes a really good point about behaviour. That's precisely the work that SAGE will be doing. They'll be looking at the behavioural impact of changes and understanding that before they advise government. So all the things that are being talked about are being done, but we want to make sure that we're in a position to have a much more conclusive picture and then move forward.
But the question, Robert, is about testing, and the government, well, Matthew Hancock has committed to 100,000 tests a day in a fortnight. We're currently at, what is it, 35,000 capacity, though actually nothing like that is being carried out.
18,000 today.
18,000. You've only got a fortnight to go. Are you really going to do it?
It's a big challenge, though. We look at how far we've come already in the past few weeks. Matt Hancock is confident that with the partnerships that we've now set up, we can achieve that. Look how far we've come in 6 weeks. We've achieved huge strides in terms of the way we're dealing with this.
You've already missed the old target, which was for mid-April, for 25,000 being carried out a day. So how are you going to get to 100,000?
We have to be ambitious. I think it would have been mealy-mouthed of us to set a target that we would easily have hit.
What is this guy on? What would you rather? To set a target that we have no chance of achieving because it sounds good, or to set a realistic target that we could achieve even though it doesn't sound like enough is being done? He seems to think the former is the better option.
Some expectation of meeting it.
But we also need to set a target that is a challenge, and this is a huge challenge. We have set that to the community who deal with this. We're confident that we can get there. We're making really good progress.
Well, we'll be back in 2 weeks and we will find out. Let's take another question now from Richard Clark.
It's time the UK started wearing face masks. In countries with a high mask wearing culture such as Japan, Singapore, China, the death rate from this virus is significantly less than it is here in the UK. Face masks are proven to help stop the spread of this virus onto someone else, so why aren't we using them? It may still be a while before restrictions are eased in the UK, so wouldn't this be a good time to use it to ask local clothing manufacturers, and there's lots of them in Walsall and Wolverhampton, to manufacture as many face masks as possible and post them out to households within the region. This would avoid a possible shortage issue further down the line.
Should we be wearing face masks, Rachel?
This is a very interesting question. Now, the WHO still says no, their advice is not to recommend that everybody, general members of the public, should wear face masks. And they have some very good reasons for concern. For instance, if you wear a mask, you are more likely to touch your face. And we know that one of the main routes of transmission of this virus of infection is you've picked it up on your hands and then you touch either your nose, your eyes or your mouth. And so if you have something across your face that invites you to touch your face, then it potentially increases the risk of you infecting yourself. There's another behavioural issue here, which is the perception that if you're wearing a mask, you are somehow more protected, and so you may be more inclined to undertake riskier behaviours. You may not socially distance in the same way that you would otherwise. So there are some, I think rightly, some real concerns around face masks. The flip side of that is there is no randomised controlled trial evidence for whether or not face masks are beneficial or not in the case of coronavirus, COVID-19 specifically. We do have some evidence for other viruses, but not this virus.
Nonetheless, lots of countries are enforcing it. So Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong. Then you've got the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Germany, France, Spain. They're all either saying people have to wear them or they're all encouraging it.
And I think the reason for this is not necessarily what the public assume to be the case. So there's two reasons for wearing a mask. One is to decrease your risk of being infected, and the other, of course, is to decrease your risk of infecting other people if you, unbeknownst to yourself, have the virus. You may be asymptomatic and unknowingly spreading it to other people. So a cloth mask is pretty rubbish as a form of protection for you against other people coughing virus particles over you. It may help a little bit, it's not that effective. But in terms of you, if you're infected, protecting other people from you transmitting the virus to them, then actually there is evidence that a cloth mask reduces the amount of virus particles you are generating to 1/36 of what you would otherwise...
1/36?
1/36.
So
yeah.
Lisa and Andy, I was just hearing what Rachel said, and I was also listening to Patrick Vallance, the government's chief scientific advisor, on Monday, who said, as you have just said, masks don't necessarily protect the general public, but they do help in stopping you transmitting it to others, which struck me in a pandemic as a pretty good thing to aim for.
Reducing the risk by 1/36. I think I might be one of those people who'd rather have the virus, get it over and done with, but then I'm also concerned about all the other things that this virus is enabling certain interests to do. If I've had the virus, do I need the vaccine? Because I don't want the vaccine. Gates can have mine.
What is the Labour view on, or does Labour have a view on masks?
Well, no, I mean, I'm not a scientist, and I would definitely be guided by people who are in terms of the advice that is given. But this week we had the situation where the governor of New York came out and said that people will only be allowed out in public because if they're wearing face masks. And I think that's caused a lot of concern for people in this country, many of whom aren't on lockdown. I know we keep talking about lockdown, but actually a lot of my constituents are still going out to work every day. Some of them are transport workers, they work in food production, as well as the care sectors that we've been talking about. But others are just simply going to work in car park companies or on construction sites. They're going to work in warehouses, packing boxes for the minimum wage. And the number of reports that I've had from employees in those industries about employers who are not following the government guidance. They're not allowing their employees to work from home if they can. They're not following and enforcing social distance measures, and they're not putting in place proper hand washing facilities. They are really, really worried by these reports about face masks, because if face masks are needed, then they obviously need them. And I think there's a couple of things that the government could do very quickly. The first is to provide a level of clarity about that, especially for people who are going out and working on the front line. And the second thing that I think that they could do as well is to take seriously this issue that there are many, many people whose employers are currently putting them at risk. I think most businesses are trying to do the right thing, but I have been overwhelmed with reports from people across the Northwest who are dealing with this, and I know that many of our mayors and our council leaders have as well, and I would urge the government to actually take some action to protect people.
Karen?
I think Lisa makes a really good point about the way companies are treating their employees at this time, because the test of leadership is not in the good times, it's in the bad times. And if a company puts people first, that's the most important thing, the safety and the welfare of their people first.
Well, you could say the same about the government, but it's been clear to me for a long while now that government, shall we say, has been putting other interests above those of the people.
And when it comes to masks, I realized when I went to Japan for the first time, when I saw people wearing masks, I was then explained that actually they want to stop you getting infected. Yeah. So that aspect of it, as
because
Rachel
the whole
says,
debate has been about whether it's protecting ourselves. But as I say, when I listened to Patrick Vallance, said, well, it can stop the transmission. I thought, well, surely that's worth having.
And to that extent, I respect the government for the way it's been dealing with this. It's been working with the scientists, listening to the scientists. We all, as a country, are following what the scientists are advising us. Maybe they will come round to saying we need to use masks. It might happen.
Well, Derek Hunter has contacted us to say it's so difficult to buy any face masks in order to protect yourself. Many outlets online are charging over the odds for masks, and that's before you add in the postage and packing. What's happening with masks? We know the government is reviewing the guidelines. Is it partly because we just haven't got enough? Or is it that genuinely, or is it that the government just isn't decided on this?
Well, I think Rachel's put the point very clearly about the evidence on this, and I think that where you haven't got clear evidence that masks are going to make that key difference, then we shouldn't be prioritising.
So why are all these other countries doing it then?
Well, I think
that's what seems puzzling. Yeah, I think to the people who are contacting us.
Well, I think the World Health Organization's advice is relevant. The advice of our medical officers and our scientific officers is clearly relevant. There are, of course, different types of masks. You know, a plain cloth mask is one thing. There are particular surgical masks that clearly are going to be of real help to people who are doing close contact work in hospitals or other places. There's a clear case there for masks.
But just for the general public, that's what the question is.
I mean, I mean, I've listened very carefully. I take the point about the idea that, you know, you wear a mask to stop you transmitting any particles or any disease to other people. I think that we're looking very carefully at the evidence on this and constantly asking ourselves questions about the strength or otherwise of it, and then taking action.
So I was walking past a supermarket and there was a long line of people standing outside. The wind was coming towards me. It occurred to me that the people standing at the front of the queue were exposed to the exhaled breath of everyone in that queue who was stood behind them, even though they were stood 2 metres apart. It made a mockery of social distancing, and wearing a mask would have had zero effect.
But at the moment, I think it's right of us to prioritise those other types of PPE that are clearly needed and are going to make a difference in terms of the transmission of this disease.
Coming to the other part of Richard's question, and given how I think it's fair to say the government was a bit caught out with PPE in terms of we haven't had enough, certainly as much as people require. Richard is saying, wouldn't it be good to get ahead of this on face masks and start asking local manufacturers to start making them? Wouldn't it be good to get in there early?
Well, I think the question of getting in there early, I think already, with regard to PPE generally, we have ramped up the operation.
But face masks in particular, that was the question.
Look, I think we've got to follow the evidence. If the evidence changes and we are told that face masks are necessary, I'm confident we can ramp it up. We do have the ability to do that. We've shown in other areas of PPE that we can do that. Let's follow that evidence and assess it regularly.
I mean, there's two important points here I'd suggest. So one is whether or not the general public should be wearing simple, they can be cloth face masks in order to reduce transmission of this virus to other people. And the jury is out there. The WHO is still not advising that, but many national countries, and New York, as you say, most definitely are. So it would be helpful to know when the government is going to give the public a definitive answer on that. I don't think the evidence is going to change quickly, so it would be helpful to know that sooner rather than later. But there's a second point about the PPE that we most definitely know is needed and is needed desperately on the front line, and that is the PPE that is protecting frontline staff, whether NHS or carers, from infection. And we know that there are huge problems with capacity there. Now, they're not unique to the UK, there are problems all over the world. But we've also got a country in lockdown right now. So we've got all these SMEs, these small and medium-sized businesses, so many people up and down the country who are not working currently. Where is the national government-led effort to boost production? We've got...
Rachel, I'll just interrupt. We've got about 20 seconds left and you want to come in.
British business is there to step up to the mark. Already Burberry is making... But we just heard Barber, they're making aprons, they're making gowns. And if masks are going to be required, I'm sure British business will be ready to make those masks.
We are out of time, I'm afraid. Question time is actually off air next week, but we'll be back the week after, which is, of course, April the 30th. So tonight, as you can see, our recorded questions came from Wolverhampton, but in 2 weeks' time, we'd like to take questions from Leeds. So obviously, you can't come to the studio, not yet, not for some time, I suspect. But we do still want, and we need to hear from you, because, of course, Question Time without an audience, even virtually, is not the same programme. So do get in touch with us. If you live in Leeds and you've something to say, and frankly, why wouldn't you? It's what we're all talking about at the moment. Go to the Question Time website and apply in the usual way. And then, if asked, you'll record your question on your phone, or we'll give you advice how to do it. And then, of course, we can play it just like the ones that you saw this evening. If you want to carry on this discussion, what we've been talking about, you can, as always, join Adrian, Charles and guests on Question Time Extra Time, and that is on 5 Live right now. But thank you very much for the moment to the panel for coming into the studio tonight. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us from Wigan. Really appreciate you joining us. And, of course, thank you to everyone who recorded a question or, of course, got in touch during the programme this evening. From Question Time for this week, we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye.
Well, the star of the show was Claire, followed by Karen. Even Lisa Nandy did well, I thought. Not only that, this week I didn't perceive any overt bias, so credit where it's due to the BBC. I've been up all night doing this video, so please give it a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. It would really help, and thank you for watching. Till the next one, later.